2015's Undertale by Toby Fox is a lot of things to a lot of people. For some, it's an immensely personal story, filled to the brim with instantly lovable, memorable characters who the player can interact with in incredibly deep and engaging ways. A game where your actions and interactions actually result in meaningful consequences that the player gets to experience firsthand, for better or for worse. For others, Undertale is an incredible work of art with its endearing, nostalgic pixel style and some of the most beautiful music they've ever heard in a video game. For others still, it's a work of comedic genius, or a fourth wall breaking, mind-bending narrative masterpiece. But what stuck out most to me personally was the game's powerful message about pacifism and violence. And it's probably not the message that you're thinking of. You see, I grew up in Ireland during the 1990s, with the backdrop of intense political violence which haunted the country, and still does to an extent. Hanging over each of our heads were the likes of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, the Miami Showband massacre, Bloody Sunday, and British state collusion with loyalist death squads leading to countless other attacks, assassinations, and massacres. You might be able to understand how, in such a brutal context ravaged by decades of war, people like me would develop a profound hatred of this oppressive violence, and consequently that the kind of message of pure universal peace and pacifism that Undertale is often portrayed as representing might be a welcome breath of fresh air. And that is the message that most people seem to have gotten from Undertale. A simplistic narrative of violence bad and that we should instead resolve our problems with kind words and friendly actions. And there might be an element of truth to that in the game's message, but only in certain specific contexts. After having researched far and wide in both popular and even academic writing, it appears that pretty much nobody seems to have explained what this game actually was saying both implicitly and explicitly about the matters of pacifism and violence. And crucially, the deep nuances between how the two main groups in the game, humans and monsters, relate to these matters. This is important not just for how it affects our understanding of the game world, but also for the powerful real-world implications of this nuanced message that'll become clear over the course of this video. So, let's get into it. To fully understand Undertale's true message, some basic background information about the story of the game world is necessary. When booting up Undertale, it's explained that, long ago, two races ruled over Earth, humans and monsters. One day, war broke out between the two races. After a long battle, the humans were victorious. They sealed the monsters underground with a magic spell. Now, pay close attention to the wording here. War broke out. Who started the war? Why did they do it? These crucial questions remain unanswered. War simply just broke out. This passive voice is used at the beginning of the story to conceal the truth, presenting it as though monsters and humans were both equally culpable for the war. As the player progresses through the game, however, it's learnt that it was the humans who initiated the violence, attacking the monsters completely unprovoked. In the waterfall section of the game, written on the walls, is a much more detailed explanation of what happened. Why did the humans attack? Indeed, it seemed they had nothing to fear. Humans are unbelievably strong. It would take the soul of nearly every monster just to equal the power of a single human soul. But humans have one weakness. Ironically, it is the strength of their soul. Its power allows it to persist outside the human body, even after death. If a monster kills a human, they can take its soul. The humans, afraid of our power, declared war on us. They attacked suddenly and without mercy. In the end, it could hardly be called a war. United, the humans were too powerful and us monsters too weak. Not a single soul was taken, and countless monsters were turned to dust. Hurt, beaten, and fearful for our lives, we surrendered to the humans. 7 of their greatest magicians sealed us underground with a magic spell. So the humans mounted this unprovoked attack against these monsters, creatures so weak that nearly every monster combined would be unable to match the strength of a single human. In doing so, the humans slaughtered countless monsters without suffering so much as one single human casualty. They drove the monsters literally underground, now condemned to a subterranean existence eternally, while the humans were free to enjoy the luxury of life up on top. Meanwhile, the monsters who survived attempted to flee further, having recently seen their family and friends being brutally, mercilessly massacred by the humans. A book in Toriel's home explains, "Trapped behind the barrier and fearful of further human attacks, we retreated. Far, far into the earth we walked until we reached the cavern's end. This was our new home." This was their new life. A life as a literal and metaphorical underclass. A life of oppression. And if there's oppression, then within that, there are oppressors and oppressed. When the game opens, we're met with the statement that two races ruled over Earth, humans and monsters. One day, war broke out between the two races. Note how instead of using the term species, the more modern, accurate and scientific label, the game instead poses these groupings in terms of race, the human race and the monster race. Referring to these groups in this racialized manner could be written off as an unimportant or unintentional quirk, if there wasn't so much evidence to the contrary. The monster race has been forced down underground into a literal subterranean, subaltern existence. A reference to an academic field known as subaltern studies, which centers on studying and analysing the experiences of the oppressed who exist below or underneath the oppressors. Primarily those who suffer from colonial and neo-colonial oppression, such as oppressed indigenous peoples, people of the third world, those who suffer racial oppression, and so on. In other words, people with their very own undertales. It's also worth highlighting that the modern conception of race, and subsequently modern racism, emerged as the justifying ideology for colonial domination and modern slavery. Intergenerational oppression through chattel slavery and even all-out genocides were excused on the basis that those affected were arbitrarily designated as, quote, lower races, using pseudo-scientific metrics like those of phrenology. So what we see here in Undertale, invoking this real-world history of colonial oppression and racial subjugation, is a clear division of the world into the oppressors above, the humans, and the oppressed below, the monsters. The so-called monster race then, despite the pains the game goes to in order to humanize them throughout, come to reflect in the game world the colonized and oppressed peoples who political philosophers like Frantz Fanon would refer to as the wretched of the earth. And like most oppressed peoples, they're keenly aware of this boot of oppression upon their neck, spending their days pining for freedom and liberation. Take the shopkeeper that you meet early on in Snowdin, for example. When asked about her life in the neutral and pacifist route, she replies that life is the same as usual, a little claustrophobic, but we all know deep down that freedom is coming, don't we? As long as we got that hope, we can grit our teeth and face the struggles day after day. That's life, ain't it? Meanwhile, when you visit her shop during the genocide route, she's already fled in fear of your genocidal violence and aggression, leaving a note for the player that simply reads, "Please don't hurt my family." This theme of the monsters longing for freedom from their oppression in this underworld emerges time and time again throughout the game. And this is important. As you move through the game world, you become aware of the fact that the monsters recognize their oppression. And not only that, they understand humans as the oppressors, even when they can't clearly identify the player themselves as a human. Monster Kid in the waterfall section of the game makes this clear when he says during the neutral and pacifist route, "Undyne is so cool, she beats up bad guys and never loses. If I was a human, I'd wet the bed every night knowing she was gonna beat me up. Because to this child, humans are the bad guys." And he even clarifies shortly after that she's too cool to ever hurt an innocent person. The implication being that this wouldn't apply to humans, the oppressors, none of whom he sees as innocent. It's also interesting to note Monster Kid's use of the word person to refer to all beings in the world, monsters themselves being afforded full personhood and personality throughout the game. Whether on the pacifist or genocide route, you play the game as part of the oppressor group, the human race, not the oppressed, the monster race, inheriting the legacy of all the horrifying, brutal violence and oppression that your people have inflicted upon each and every character you meet in this underworld. And with this context, it makes a lot more sense why the monsters are attacking you in the first place. Regardless of the path you personally take in the game, your people have already committed literal genocide against them, forced them from their homes on the Earth's surface, sealed them underground, and condemned each and every one of them to life as an oppressed underclass. In such a context, their attacks against the player can be considered nothing more than self-defense against the threat of further violent oppression of the monsters by the human race. And so, when we arrive at the concept of pacifism and non-violent conflict resolution that Undertale has been widely praised for, we need to consider this broader context of the oppressors and the oppressed, something which doesn't appear to have been meaningfully discussed so far. This question of pacifism doesn't exist in a vacuum, detached from the world around it. As a human in these monsters' worlds, the human you play as is imbued with this history of brutal genocidal oppression. Many monsters see this in you, and so consequently they attack. However, the game gives you, as part of the oppressor group, the choice to either A, fight the monsters and continue the cycle of genocidal violence against the oppressed, or B, to break with this bloody history and to instead talk with the monsters and solve the conflict with words or other non-violent actions, maybe even befriend them. And indeed, you as a human are encouraged to take the non-violent approach to the monsters right from the start. A frog in the ruins who recognises you as a human pleads that if a monster doesn't want to fight you, please use some mercy, human. The choices you make in Undertale with regard to whether or not you use violence has a profound impact on all aspects of the game, including the identity of the main character themselves. Towards the end of the game, you reach a location called New Home, in which you'll find a mirror that reflects the nature of the path the player has chosen. If the player pursues the genocide route, upon checking the reflection in the mirror, the player will be met with the text, "It's me, Kara," using the first person pronoun. In this timeline, the player has now become the genocidal human that they were expected to be by most of the monsters. However, if the player decides instead to take the pacifist route, pursuing non-violence towards the monsters, the text when checking your reflection will read, "Despite everything, it's still you." Switching to the second person pronoun. You, despite being born into these blood-stained human boots, despite the horrors that your people have inflicted upon these monsters, you have made the conscious choice to decisively break away from that history of oppressive violence and instead side with the oppressed. And in doing so, you've transformed both yourself and the entire world around you. Now, so far, the main point of this video has been to show how clearly Undertale distinguishes between the oppressors, the humans, and the oppressed, the monsters, and perhaps gesturing towards how each group might relate to violence. But this point now needs to be fleshed out fully. While the game encourages the player as a human to take the pacifist route, the most celebrated and revered monster in Undertale, in contrast, happens to be one of the most violent. This is referring, of course, to Undyne. Now, surely this is some kind of double standard, where violence is okay for thee, but not for me, isn't it? How can it be that this monster attacking and using such extreme force against you can be seen in such a positive light when the game is otherwise, it appears, at such pains to promote the path of non-violence? Undertale provides the answer to this during the main confrontation with Undyne in the pacifist and neutral playthrough when she proclaims that, You're standing in the way of everybody's hopes and dreams. Your life is all that stands between us and our freedom. Freedom. That's the difference. This is the violence of liberation rather than the violence of oppression. She isn't fighting out of malice, cruelty, or for her own personal self-interest. She's fighting selflessly on behalf of all the oppressed monsters who've been forced into a subaltern existence by the humans. The monsters whose hearts she feels beating together, who've spent their whole lives toiling in misery and pining for freedom. This distinction between liberatory violence and oppressive violence is often extremely difficult for those from oppressor group backgrounds to understand, especially well-meaning progressives who wish to dogmatically assert universally that all violence is equally unacceptable, without understanding how this centers the world around their own subjective experience of living in positions of such privilege that they've never had to deeply consider how so many oppressed people have had no choice but to resort to force as their only possible means of liberating themselves. Not out of malice or hatred, not to oppress, and certainly not out of some twisted desire to inflict suffering on others. In fact, the oppressed generally hate violence, just wanting it to finally stop once and for all. As James Connolly, writing in the context of the Irish War for National Liberation from British colonial occupation, explained, "We do not believe that war is glorious, inspiring, or regenerating. We believe it to be hateful, damnable, and damning. War is hell. But if freedom is on the farther side, then even hell shall be allowed to daunt us." Speaking directly to those of oppressor group backgrounds who struggle to understand this difference between the violence of oppression and the violence of liberation, Kwame Ture explained the matter as such.
Well, I'd just like to state my opinion that I think violence is barbaric and stupid and repulsive, and that's my opinion.
But please, may I ask you a question, please? Just for clarification. If you were a slave and I were your master, and the only way for you to be free was to strike your blow to kill me, what would you do? You didn't answer? Oh, I didn't hear him answer.
If there was any doubt about how clearly Undertale has drawn this distinction between the malicious violence of the oppressors and the liberatory force of the oppressed, this distinction is made explicit in the name of the song that plays behind the main battle with Undyne. In the neutral and pacifist route, the music played is called Spear of Justice, referring of course to Undyne's signature weapon, the spear. And in combining that with justice, the game is here making clear that Undyne's armed resistance is indeed just, or justified, given the context of oppression and the monster's fight for liberation. However, it's demonstrated even more clearly and a lot more poignantly when fighting Undyne the Undying in the genocide route. When the fight breaks out, a new song begins to play, this one called Battle Against a True Hero. Undertale here makes explicitly clear its view that the true hero's path is not always one of pacifism, but, in the face of such oppression, the path of resistance. While you may play the game as the main character, Undyne is Undertale's real hero, fighting for the liberation of the entirety of her people, the so-called monsters. You, the human, to the oppressed monsters, play the role of the antagonist. This is only drawn out more clearly in the genocide route as you've made the conscious choice to continue the path of genocidal violence that you've inherited from the rest of the human race. Undyne, conversely, on behalf of her oppressed people, musters up the determination to fight beyond even death itself before her monster body is overwhelmed by determination and, like the amalgamations of the True Lab, melts under the pressure of the player's relentless, merciless, malicious attacks. Even when passing away, with her last words, she remains fully committed to the cause of liberation of her people. If you think I'm gonna give up hope, you're wrong, because I've got my friends behind me. She passes with a smile on her face, proclaiming proudly and resolutely that this world will live on. Her unwavering commitment to the collective liberation of her people persists to her dying breath and beyond. And through the people she gave her life for, she herself lives on eternally. In some ways, it's reminiscent of Bobby Sands' famous words prior to his death in prison for fighting for the freedom of Ireland from colonial oppression, that our revenge will be the laughter of our children. A true determination to the protection and liberation of the oppressed, even in the very face of death itself. And this is the fundamental difference in the nature of the violence utilised in Undertale. Whether you personally take the pacifist route or the genocide route, when the monsters attack you, they're fighting for liberation from you, the humans who've condemned them to an oppressed life in this underworld. This is the reason why that frog at the beginning in the ruins pleads with you, the human, to show monsters mercy, specifically referring to you as human. Undertale has a clear understanding of this fundamental difference between liberatory violence and oppressive violence. And the game even presents nuance and clarification within this understanding. While most people in the game revere and celebrate Undyne, the true hero, nobody celebrates Flowey for behaving violently, despite also being part of the oppressed group, because Flowey's violence is not liberatory violence. It's malicious, cruel, and does nothing to further the cause of freedom for the monsters. This emphasises that being part of an oppressed group in and of itself doesn't automatically make one's use of force acceptable, much less so heroic, if that force isn't used in service of the collective liberation of the oppressed. So what we see here in Undertale, upon deeper examination, is not naive support for pacifism as a universally applicable principle, as has hitherto been suggested by most critical analyses of the game, but in fact a much more sophisticated and nuanced examination of the tactics of violence and non-violence, and the contexts where each might be appropriate in relation to liberation and oppression. Specifically, the game supports the path of non-violence from those of the oppressor group, humans, towards the oppressed, monsters, even when the humans are confronted with attacks by the monsters. And this is the message that most people took away from the game. But instead of understanding this in the context of the oppressors and the oppressed, it was mistakenly applied universally. In actual fact, when viewed through the lens of oppression and liberation, we can see that Undertale actively supports the liberatory force of the oppressed who've been left with no other options, of the people rising up in resistance and fighting for their freedom. And make no mistake, this goes far beyond just celebrating the heroism and justice in Undyne's use of force. The game also goes as far as to posit, in no uncertain terms, that in the real world, that is our human world, force sometimes has to be used to liberatory ends. After the true pacifist run, Asriel advises you, be careful in the outside world, okay? Despite what everyone thinks, it's not as nice as it is here. There are a lot of Floweys out there, and not everything can be resolved by just being nice. Frisk, don't kill and don't be killed, alright? That's the best you can strive for. What's presented is a delicate balancing act. An acknowledgement that you can't resolve all issues by just being pleasant and talking it out. That liberatory force in the face of oppression will be necessary, but that it also requires deep caution so as not to go overboard. Liberatory force ultimately seeks to put an end to the violence faced by the oppressed. Anything beyond that point of ending the oppression is an excess which must be minimised as much as is possible. And so, within that framework, Asriel highlights, don't kill and don't be killed. That's the best you can strive for. And in our real world today, that is what's strived for by those who take the path of resistance and use liberatory force against oppression. For example, under the oppression of a state that slaughtered tens of thousands of innocent Filipino workers and peasants under their so-called war on drugs, as well as countless other mass murderous campaigns, the resistance fighters of their National Democratic Movement have worked to systematically disarm the fascistic state forces by confiscating their weapons, limiting the damage that can be inflicted upon the Filipino people. The resistance fighters have to do this forcefully, but also make sure to use the minimum level of violence possible in the process of disarming the fascistic state forces. You can see this commitment to fighting humanely clearly in videos where they raid state military bases, announce their name, and emphasize that they adhere to the international rules of war. This is to assure the state soldiers that if they lie on the ground with their hands on their heads, then they're completely safe and won't be hurt. Because they too strive not to kill and not to be killed, even where force is required to bring about liberation. This demonstrates the fundamental difference between fighting for freedom and fighting to oppress. Liberating in the process even those who initially played the role of enemies by simply disarming them and protecting their lives. This isn't some bloodthirsty mob seeking revenge. This is a risen people fighting for liberation as humanely as possible to end the fascistic violence that's indiscriminately massacred so many of them. And in doing so, they realise that this can only successfully be achieved by forcing their oppressors at gunpoint to cease their oppression and hand over their weapons. A similar path is seen in Undertale, where even when you're attacked, your goal is essentially to disarm your assailant. However, in Undertale, this is done through words and kind gestures. And in the real world, where possible, this too of course should be done by words. But, as Azrael says, not everything can be resolved by just being nice in the real world. And in such cases, the best that can be strived for is to not kill and not be killed. At the beginning of this video, I briefly discussed the backdrop of political violence of the Ireland that I was born and raised in. Coming from this context, a context of colonial and neo-colonial oppression, there was always a clear understanding of the difference between the liberatory force of the oppressed as opposed to the repressive violence of the oppressors. This crucial distinction isn't lost on Undertale. The game, in fact, has a far more sophisticated, nuanced, and profound political message than it's been given credit for so far. Rather than dogmatically insisting upon pacifism universally, it understands that the oppressed in so many cases have no choice but to fight for their freedom. And more than just passively observing that there's a difference between those who fight for the liberation of the oppressed and those who fight to oppress, Undertale itself as a video game functions as a form of political activism that encourages the player, who occupies the role of an oppressor in the game world, a human, to stop fighting against the oppressed, the monsters, and instead to join them. Indeed, it could be said that the game itself, through showing you the consequences of your actions and holding you accountable for what you've done with various fourth wall breaking mechanisms, through this creative new form of political activism, Undertale disarms the player themselves, encouraging you to side with the oppressed in their struggles for liberation. Gur míle maith guibh agus slán go fóill.